Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, as you can see on this beautiful leather-bound Easton Press edition. And as with most Easton Press editions, you have a very handsome frontispiece. In this particular case, it's of Dickens himself. And then in each of these chapters, you're going to find an engraving at the beginning of the chapter, which highlights something particular that happens in that chapter, which you could say it's a bit of a sneak preview if you haven't read the book before. And then periodically you have these beautiful color lithographs of particular scenes. So one of these that is just, as with all Easton Press editions, a real pleasure to read. So if you're interested in getting this edition, I can recommend it. I haven't really run across an Easton Press edition I haven't recommended, unless, of course, it's Pilgrim's Progress, which is total trash anyway, but that's a discussion for another time. So, Great Expectations. Like all Dickens books, you have a granular description of people's characters and a wonderful illustration of how we so often lack self-awareness as individuals. So very often you'll see a character articulating some ideas that clearly lack self-awareness. The reader, everyone in the universe knows you're thinking the wrong way, but we very often are blind to our own faults, our dealings with others, and we miss big cues. So that's how all Dickens books are similar. They're all different in how these characters interact with each other and end up resolving in a conclusion. There are generally, in Dickens, goodies and generally baddies, and generally the goodies prevail. What was interesting to me about this is I don't think I realized until this reading of it that there is an alternative ending, except the alternative ending is the ending that most of us have in our editions of the book, in which effectively there is an ambiguous parting with Estella. So I'll read this, I suppose, massive spoiler alert if you haven't read Great Expectations before. I'm about to read the last 6-7 lines of the book. "We are friends," said I. This is Pip. "We are friends," said I, rising and bending over her as she rose from the bench. "And will continue friends apart," said Estella. I took her hand in mine, and we went out of the ruined place. And as the morning mist had risen long ago, when I first left the forge, so the evening mists were rising now, and in all the broad expanse of tranquil light they showed to me, I saw no shadow of another parting from her. So he wasn't going to part from her again. We have the mists rising and falling, and that's another big theme in the book. I don't know if we'll have time to discuss it in the review, but that feels wrong to me. And part of my research in understanding the book involved finding out that Dickens only had about 1,000 words left after he'd gotten to a certain part in the text to try to wrap everything up. And that's pretty hard to do. So some might argue that this was quite contrived. However, he did have an original ending, which one of his all writers have people that they trust to read through their text and to give them feedback. But some people rejected, one in particular, I think it was Wilkie Collins, did not like this ending and told Dickens that. But I'm going to read this now. This edition also has the original ending. It says, "There was no chapter 20 as now, but the sentence which opens it, for 11 years in the original, altered to 8 years, followed the paragraph about his business partnership with Herbert. From which point here was the close. It was 2 years more before I saw herself. I had heard of her as leading a most unhappy life, and as being separated from her husband, who had used her with great cruelty, and who had become quite renowned as a compound of pride, brutality, and meanness. I had heard of the death of her husband from an accident consequent on ill-treating a horse, and of her being married again to a Shropshire doctor, who, against his interest, had once very manfully interposed, on an occasion when he was in professional attendance on Mr. Drummle, and had witnessed such outrageous treatment of her. I had heard that the Shropshire doctor was not rich, and that they lived on her own personal fortune. I was in England again, in London, and walking along Piccadilly with little Pip, when a servant came running after me to ask would I step back to a lady in a carriage who wished to speak to me. It was a little pony carriage which the lady was driving, and the lady and I looked sadly enough on one another. I am greatly changed, I know, but I thought you would like to shake hands with Estella too, Pip. Lift up that pretty child and let me kiss it. She supposed the child, I think, to be my child. I was very glad afterwards to have had the interview, for in her face and in her voice and in her touch, she gave me the assurance that suffering had been stronger than Miss Havisham's teaching, and had given her a heart to understand what my heart used to be. I think, beautiful ending, and very appropriate, and I suppose revealing to myself why I prefer that ending to the Hollywood happy ending that most of us have in our editions of this text, is my desire for people to have long-term consequences from the results of our decisions. And that's because I think so often we're perfectly happy to have long-term results from the results of our good decisions. So, for example, in the case of my parents, married for 42 years until my father passed away. My mother mourns him, that they made a good decision to get married, and the long-term consequences were that they have children who love them and a marriage that lasted. But for whatever reason, we wish to avoid the consequences of our poor decisions. And understandably, I understand human nature, and I'm speaking for myself, obviously we want to avoid bad things and embrace the good things. However, the logic should carry us both ways, that if we have lasting consequences of good decisions, we should have lasting consequences of bad decisions as well. And that isn't because I wish bad on people or I wish evil in people's lives. However, those bad things, those evil things, serve as corrections, serve as ways to remind us not only to not do it again, because I'm already stuck with at least one bad consequence, but to remind me the way that scars remind us of physical trauma, that bad things, bad consequences can serve as emotional scar tissue to help remind us of what we should do. And so my angst at the current modern ending to Great Expectations is that it doesn't fit. The entire book puts us onto a trajectory. And I would say that Estella and Pip are two sides of the same argument, which is, am I a prisoner to how I was raised, or can I make my own decisions? And Estella and Pip both go from it from different perspectives. So Estella was raised to, hate men, to make them her plaything, to use them as she saw fit. And Pip was taken out of his station. He was born into a low station. He was brought up to a high station. He didn't do well with that, and eventually found a compromise, you could say, between the two stations by being well connected to his family, old Joe Gardry, who is one of my favorite characters in Dickens, and his new life as a gentleman of sorts. But there's that tension from moving from one class to another, and both of them were raised out of poor situations, terrible situations, and they both went completely different ways with it. And I say in part because Estella was a prisoner to how she was raised. She was unable to break free of her programming to think and act for herself. And Pip, he does manage to think and act for himself, although in the beginning he does have some of the same influences that Estella does. But in the end, he's able to do a good turn for everybody involved, learn a lesson about himself. And in that original ending, neither of them have what they could have had some time ago because they understand the circumstances have changed. I think we know that for ourselves in our relationships, both romantic and otherwise in our lives, that a moment has passed in which something could be, and that's okay, in part because this life is not the only life we have. There is a life after death. There is an eternity to contemplate other things other than the decisions that we make here in this life. But it underlines the importance of the decisions of this life to not only determine our present, but to determine our future, eternity beyond this very short moment of life that passes before we move to eternity and the consequences, eternity which will be determined by the consequences of the decisions we made in this life. So Great Expectations, I think, very much will take you down some of these roads. I didn't talk about some of the other themes of the book because it's a big one. But in any case, I think most people are familiar enough with the text, and I think a lot of other book reviews are going to take you down some of those other roads analyzing particular plot points. This particular review, I simply wanted to focus on two different endings and why I prefer the original. But I have been overruled, not only by the author himself, but by generations of editors who have chosen the revised ending. So there it is. If you like what I had to say here, please hit the like button. Please hit subscribe. These are ways that the video can be found by others. If you want to support my work, if you liked what I did, you want to send me a tip, you want to support this work, there's a link to my Patreon below where you can vote with your feet. And there's also a link to the bookshop edition of this book. If you I don't think there's one for the Easton Press edition, but there'll be a link to another edition down below. If you want to support my work, that's another way, is buying through the affiliate link. So, hope you read Great Expectations and have some thoughts on your own about how you feel about different endings. But until next time, enjoy your reading.